Well, welcome everybody to the Palestine Exploration Fund for our second lecture this year. Before we move on to tonight's event, I just want to mention our forthcoming lecture, which is next month, 13th of March, here at 6 o'clock, and it is The Dead Sea, a 10,000-year-old history, with Nir Ariely of Leeds University, and it's the launch of his amazing book. Actually, I should show the book, which is all about the Dead Sea, this extraordinary place, this unique singularity, almost, point on Earth. And we're really looking forward to that. However, we must live in the present. And tonight, we're going back to the 1870s with a group of Mormon travellers, with Matt Gray, who's here this evening to talk with us. And I think it's kind of... we tend to forget that travel is a really difficult thing. For people in this era, in the 19th century, and for really a lot of the 20th century as well, travel was a big deal. You didn't just, have the problem with customs and, your baggage getting lost and all the rest of it. You had huge troubles to surmount. You had health problems. You had long journeys by sea. Great deal of difficulty, lots of bureaucracy. So for people to make that kind of journey, it required a huge amount of commitment, whether they were explorers working for the Palestine Exploration Fund or whether they were kind of early tourists, part of Thomas Cook's burgeoning travel empire. So to talk to us tonight about a group of these tourists, I suppose one could call them, pilgrims from Utah in the 1870s is Matt Gray. Now, I'm going to tell you all about Matt because he looks like such a young chap, but he can't be because he is a professor of ancient scripture and coordinator of the ancient Near Eastern Studies program at Brigham Young University. And he takes part in the Hukok excavation project in the Galilee, which is an amazing site, and I hope we're going to get you back to talk about that at some stage. And he is also a former research fellow at the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research in Jerusalem. And he is a founding co-chair of the Archaeology of Roman Palestine unit of the Society for Biblical Literature. Quite a CV, if I may say so. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Matt.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you for this invitation to be here tonight. I have so long appreciated the work of the Palestine Exploration Fund, so to be able to come here, present some thoughts with you, and spend the day with you. You were so kind to open up to our students earlier today to see some archival materials, so I just want to say thank you for having me. I was very honored, actually, when Felicity asked if I would participate in this lecture series. It was really fun to talk with her about, well, what topics should we look at? And I listed off some things that I do with my personal research on the material culture of Roman Palestine, my work at the Hukok Synagogue in Galilee with Jody Magnus. And just kind of almost as a side, I mentioned, well, and I also have this side project that a few years ago I became interested in this group of Latter-day Saint or Mormon leaders who went to Palestine in 1873. And, boy, while they were there, they saw the dawn of our discipline, basically. They went to Moses Shapira's antiquities shop and they saw the tunnels dug by Charles Warren. And I just kind of mentioned that as a side. Felicity immediately writes back and says, oh, do the Mormon one. So that wins for curiosity alone, right? That's kind of a PEF niche is what she said. But then I also heard her say to a colleague at the end of last month's lecture, oh, Mormons, Shapira, and Jerusalem, what could possibly go wrong? So hopefully, even though this is not my main topic of research, it has been a side project to try to recover this story. For some time now, it's a project that I've really fallen in love with, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of this material with you today. And also learning from you as you have insights on these stories as well. So before we talk about this 1873 trip to Palestine by Mormon or Latter-day Saint leaders from Utah, I thought I would take just a moment, and for those who might not be as familiar with the Latter-day Saint or Mormon tradition, just to give just a very basic background of who are the Mormons, who are the Latter-day Saints in the 19th century, as a way to kind of appreciate their experience coming and seeing Palestine through their eyes. in this time. So very briefly, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often referred to as the Mormons, was a religious movement founded in America by a man named Joseph Smith, who in the 1830s and 1840s founded this American restorationist movement on the American frontier. In Ohio, started in New York, moved to Ohio, Missouri, and ultimately Illinois, where he died in 1844. But in the following years, his successor, Brigham Young, actually led the main body of Latter-day Saints or Mormon pioneers from the Mississippi River all the way across the American plains to what today is the state of Utah, or the Salt Lake Valley in the Intermountain West, the Rocky Mountain area in the western United States. At the time, they were fleeing the U.S. government and settling in what was essentially Mexico. But by the time they settled there, the Mexican War shifted boundaries, and they found themselves in the United States once again, but a far-off territory that they eventually named Utah. So it was in Utah that Brigham Young and the main body of Latter-day Saints who moved to the west, they settled in Salt Lake Valley, would eventually build the now iconic Salt Lake City Temple, which still stands today in Salt Lake. If you've been there, you may have seen it. And it's going to be this era right here where our story actually occurs. I didn't want to, obviously go too much into the history or theology of Mormonism, but I just wanted to give you a feel for where the movement started, where they're geographically located in the western United States in the 1870s under a now much older Brigham Young, who is leading the church, and that is where our story begins. Now, the last thing I want to say about kind of Latter-day Saint doctrine or theology is that from the very beginning of this American restorationist movement, there had always been a fascination with the fulfillment of biblical end times prophecies as they understood them, right? Including biblical end times prophecies as it relates to the Holy Land. Right? Latter-day Saints, like many other American Protestants, would often read the prophecies of Isaiah, for example, or the kind of the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible, as if it's a future era of flourishing in Palestine, a future era where Jerusalem and the Judean desert would blossom like a rose. A lot of quoting from Ezekiel and the vision of just kind of the end times flourishing of the Holy Land. And that is something that is there in Latter-day Saint thinking from the very beginning. In fact, even though my talk tonight focuses on a trip that Latter-day Saint leaders take in 1873, that was not the first time that Latter-day Saints had been to Palestine. The first Latter-day Saint to ever go to Jerusalem was actually sent by Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church. And in 1841, Joseph Smith sent then Apostle Orson Hyde to the Holy Land. He was there for a very brief time. He went to Jerusalem for, I don't think he was there for more than a week or two at the most. He looked around. Obviously, 1841, there's not yet that burgeoning tourism industry. So he saw the old city as it existed in 1841. He went to the top of the Mount of Olives and cobbled some stones together to build almost an altar-like structure where he offered a prayer that these biblical end times prophecies would soon be fulfilled on the land. And then he left. And so there's not a lot of time, not a lot of material there to work with, although I will say that for most Latter-day Saint scholars who are interested in Palestine, 19th century Ottoman period, this usually is the trip that we focus on, probably because Hyde was sent by Joseph Smith, the founder of the church. There's a really interesting connection there. But I'll be totally honest, this is a fascinating story and it is worthy of note, but I have found that it's the next trip to Palestine that was by far the more interesting. And so the trip that I'm going to talk about is actually the second time that, in this case, an entire group of Latter-day Saint leaders leave America, travel to Ottoman Palestine, and they are there for 2 months. And they have a remarkable experience. And it's this 1873, what at the time was called an apostolic mission to Palestine, that I want to talk about tonight. One of the reasons why I think this story is so much more interesting than the Orson Hyde visit, although that is fascinating too, is because this one is so well documented. Not only is this group there for almost 2 months in 1873, but almost every member of this group, and I'll introduce them to you in a minute, almost every member of this group kept journals, diaries, they sent letters, extremely detailed accounts of almost every day from the moment they left Salt Lake City all the way to their time in Jerusalem and back. So it's extremely well documented. Anyone who is interested in travel narratives or travel logistics in this period, their materials are extraordinary in their detail. It's also extraordinary that in the Salt Lake archives, the church archives in Salt Lake City, we have their artifacts. We can look through their guidebooks. We have little knickknacks and souvenirs that they collected. And frankly, I just think the time period that they are visiting Jerusalem is one of the most fascinating decades of the 19th century, because it happens to be that when they show up, almost all the colorful characters that we've come to know here at the PEF are all in operation. They go to Moses Shapiro's antiquities shop. They see the tunnels that Charles Warren had just dug. Right? They were looking at maps and talking about survey things that Charles Wilson had done just a few years earlier. They're looking at fresh illustrations that came to define 19th century imagination. And they're right there in the thick of it in this fascinating moment. So I really felt like all that evidence converged to provide such a rich and dynamic background for their visit. And because this visit was so, in my opinion, understudied, I just thought this would be a really great opportunity to try looking at this rich and dynamics and complex moment in the discovery, the exploration of Palestine through the eyes of this really unique group of Mormon leaders from the western mountains of America. And so that's kind of the story that I want to tell tonight. I don't have any great thesis statement or great argument that I'll be trying to make tonight. It's just telling their story through their lens and trying to experience the entire journey of travel from their vantage point. I hope that for some of us, for some of you, I hope that it adds at least one more piece of the puzzle, one more way to kind of reconstruct these experiences that many, many pilgrimage groups were having. So let's go and talk about this 1873 apostolic mission to Palestine. Of course, by 1873, unlike when Orson Hyde visited in 1841, by 1873, tourism to Palestine was now flourishing, right, by this point. Now you had pilgrims coming from all over Western Europe and America to visit Palestine, to see the holy sites. You've got the most famous, of course, just occurred a few years before this group came, and that, of course, is Mark Twain, right? This is literally in the era, within a decade, of Mark Twain's journey to Palestine, his wonderful account, Innocents Abroad, of his journeys to the region, very satirical description of the traditions and the conditions, and in so many ways, this itself is a fascinating resource. It's right in this time period when this group goes. In fact, one reminder that Felicity mentioned in her introduction is that this is also the very decade when the Thomas Cook Travel Company began organizing tours for Westerners to come to Palestine, right, to come to Jerusalem. He had long been bringing tourists to Egypt and other parts of Europe, but as far as I can tell, and I'm not a Thomas Cook scholar, if any of you are, please let me know, but as far as I can tell, I think it was in 1872 that the Thomas Cook Company, that sound about right, that the Thomas Cook Company first announced that they would begin leading tours to Palestine, meaning the year before our group goes. In fact, if I'm right, I think actually that our group that we're talking about tonight might have been on either the first or at least the second of the Thomas Cook trips to Palestine. And the reason why I think that's the case is because, as far as I can tell, in 1872, when the Thomas Cook Travel Company started advertising for their Palestine trip, they did a kind of a whirlwind tour of the United States to drum up interest. And they actually go across the U.S. giving lectures about Palestine and advertising for the tours. And in 1872, this kind of nationwide American advertising tour of the Thomas Cook Company, they stop in Utah. And they go to Salt Lake City, where Brigham Young and Latter-day Saint Mormon leaders host them, and actually fill what's called the Salt Lake Tabernacle. If you've ever heard of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, it's the second most iconic building in Salt Lake City. This photograph here shows the Salt Lake Temple still being built, which it was under construction in the 1870s, but what was already made was this large assembly hall called the Tabernacle in Salt Lake. And as far as I can tell, the agents of the Thomas Cook advertising tour stopped in Salt Lake City, actually gave their spiel here in the Mormon Tabernacle on Temple Square in Salt Lake City. And it was after that advertising lecture that, which apparently was quite successful, because Brigham Young immediately stands up and decrees that he's going to send a handful of Mormon leaders on that tour. I said, I don't know for sure that this is the first Thomas Cook tour to Palestine, but it might be. I mean, it's within a year of them announcing it. So in any case, that's where this whole thing gets started. It's 1872, the Thomas Cook Company advertising, and Brigham Young decides to organize a small group of Mormon leaders and a few other associates and send them on the Thomas Cook tour. So what we're about ready to see in their story is what these Thomas Cook tours looked like from the very beginning, including the detailed logistics of travel, what they saw, their itineraries, and kind of how this type of tour was experienced, in this case by Western religious leaders in the Western United States in the 1870s. So really is, in my mind, a very compelling and interesting story in so many ways. So let me introduce you to the group that goes on this tour. They called themselves the Palestine Tourists. And so turns out, here's the crew. First of all, we had 3 senior Mormon leaders that were appointed by Brigham Young to go on this trip. Those leaders are George A. Smith, here on the right. So George A. Smith is a fascinating guy. He, in this case, is the most senior leader of the church. He was a member of the church's governing first presidency, the highest governing body in the church. He was a counselor to Brigham Young. He was also a cousin to Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. So he had a long-standing connection in the community, and he was also a very large man. He was well over 300 pounds. Keep that in mind as we talk about some of the travel logistics here in a few minutes. And he also, by far, I think, had the most jovial personality out of all these guys, because he is literally the one who has Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad in his pocket the whole time and tries to channel his inner Twain as he is himself commenting on the sites. You'll see some of that come out tonight. So that's George A. Smith. Lorenzo Snow is another member of the 12 apostles of the church in the 1870s. Lorenzo Snow also has a fascinating background. As a younger man, before he converted to Mormonism, Lorenzo Snow was a young student of Hebrew at Oberlin College, studying with a Jewish scholar named Joshua Seixas. And it was Hebrew studies that led him in connection with Joseph Smith, and then he joins the church. There's some really interesting stories here. Very solemn personality in this case, unlike George A. Smith, who's constantly trying to channel his inner Mark Twain. Lorenzo Snow is always trying to find the kind of the pious experience, right? Really, he wants to feel deeply the religious experience of going to these traditional sites. And then there was another member of the 12 apostles named Albert Carrington, whose personality doesn't show up at all in these texts. Really, we just don't really know much about him, or at least I don't. But in addition to that, it's not just those 3. There were also 2 women on the trip, which makes this really interesting to see it through their eyes. In my opinion, the most important member, maybe the whole company, was the woman on the right. Her name is Eliza R. Snow. She was a very early convert to Mormonism, very closely associated with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. She eventually makes the pioneer trek across the West, and she's now in her 80s. And she will go on this tour as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see her as an 80-year-old get on the horse and ride through the Judean desert. It's really kind of fun to see the experience through her eyes. She was also the head of the Mormon women's organization called the Female Relief Society. So she was a very important leader in the church in the 1870s. Her traveling companion was a young woman named Clara Little. These two would end up sharing their tent together as the Thomas Cook Company set up the different travel tents to make their way across the desert and so forth. So these two shared a tent. I will say really quickly, for time's sake, I'll just summarize this. It is interesting to note that Eliza Snow was completely caught off guard when Brigham Young told her that he wanted her to be part of this company of Palestine tourists. And then in her journal, she makes this really interesting remark. She says, now that you mention it, I do seem to remember Joseph Smith, prophesying that one day I would go to Jerusalem, and here I am in my 80s, and I guess I'm going to Jerusalem. And so it's this kind of moment that brings her back to her experience with the church's founder from several decades earlier. So she's going to be a fantastic personality to watch. She's also a poetess. So along the way, she will be literally writing poems at almost every site. So in terms of women's travel narratives through Palestine and women's poetry, as they're experiencing Palestine, the writings of Eliza R. Snow are well worth a look. And then finally, the rest of the company included kind of a young, dashing missionary named Thomas Jennings, Faramores Little, who was a businessman, very wealthy businessman in Salt Lake City. He was probably funding a lot of this. He's Clara Little's father, and then a Salt Lake City newspaper man named Paul Shetler. And this is the group of Palestine tourists. So this is basically the group that's going to leave Utah, go across the United States, across the Atlantic, across Europe, and then ultimately onto Jerusalem. Okay, so with that introduction to the group itself, let's talk about their trip. It is interesting to note that from the archives in Salt Lake City and from their own writings, so as you read their letters, their diaries, their personal reminiscences, we can cobble together a modest list of the resources that they brought with them. They, like most pilgrims probably, brought with them the Bible, of course, because they were going to be seeing the whole thing through a biblical lens. But they also brought the following volumes. We already know, as I mentioned, that George A. Smith had a copy of Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad with him. He read it frequently while he was at the sites. He would quote from it, and he would try to imitate it himself in his own writings. Twain probably did it better, but it is fun to see George A. Smith at least allude to the Twain writings. And the other thing that we also know they had, this is a volume that is in the church archives in Salt Lake, they had the Jabez Burns travel guide, right, that was published just a few years earlier, in 1870. Jabez Burns was a minister here in London. And he had produced a help book for the travelers to the east, including Egypt, Palestine, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. And you'll notice that this book is done in arrangement with Thomas Cook. This is before Thomas Cook had their own guide to Palestine. So apparently some of the early Thomas Cook travelers would actually use the Jabez Burns guidebook. And so they're having these in their packs, and they're bringing these resources with them to Palestine, and these books occasionally show up in their descriptions as they're trying to make sense of what they're looking at. The last thing I'll say about the group's document data set, I guess, is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, this is so well documented. And one of the reasons why it's so well documented is because every member of the group would write letters back to Salt Lake City. Those letters were often published in Salt Lake City newspapers so that local Latter-day Saints back in Utah territories, could experience this journey through their eyes. So many letters are frequently being published in newspapers like the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, some Latter-day Saint publications back home. And eventually, after the group returned back to Utah in 1876, Eliza R. Snow ends up compiling all of that into a single publication called The Correspondence of Palestine Tourists. And it's all their letters. It's a remarkable collection of detailed descriptions of what this journey looked like for them and what they thought about it and felt about it as they went. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with what the journey looked like for them. As you read through their letters, it is a fascinating reminder, at least it was for me, that these tourists who go to Palestine in this period, they don't just show up in Palestine. And that's usually the part that I focus on as I'm reading their stories. But these letters are a reminder that they had to start from their points of origin, and that itself might have been a massive undertaking, as Felicity already alluded to. In the case of these Latter-day Saint leaders, what that meant was leaving the Utah territories in the Rocky Mountains of the United States. And in this case, they were able to hop on a train and go back eastward across the United States. It is fascinating to read their letters as they are sitting on a train going eastward across the plains, because a lot of these people, when they were much younger, traveled westward across the plains on foot to get to Utah, right? And so Eliza Snow's journal, for example, she's just fascinated by the ease of travel on a train as she's passing literally the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains. She's like thinking about what it was like 30 years ago to actually walk this thing. So that itself was a unique experience for them as they traveled eastward. They eventually made it to New York City, where they boarded a ship, sailed across the Atlantic, all of which, of course, was its own adventure of seasickness, and you can imagine all the things that go with that, until they finally arrived in London. And I admit, actually, it's only been in the last week or two that I decided to personally spend a little bit more time with their descriptions of what it was like to stop over in London. I thought, we're actually here in London, what did they experience here? It's pretty fascinating, actually. It turns out, in this case, to whatever extent they represent other Thomas Cook tour groups, this group, Latter-day Saints, they show up in London, they get off at the Euston Station, and they immediately check in to the Thomas Cook boarding house right across the street from the British Museum. That was new to me. I did not know that Thomas Cook had an office and a boarding house literally right across the street on, was it Great Russell Street? right across the street from the British Museum. In fact, actually the other day I went to 59 Great Russell Street just to see what it was like today. It's like, it's above a shop now or something. But this is basically the view they would have had of the British Museum. And apparently, at least for the next few years, Thomas Cook would regularly host their groups at this as kind of a place to stop as they're on their way off to the east. So you can imagine this group of Latter-day Saints. They're in the Thomas Cook boarding house. They're overlooking the British Museum. Naturally, they visit the British Museum. So in their case, their first exposure to the Holy Land was actually not the Holy Land itself. It was the artifacts that were collected in the British Museum. And so, of course, I don't have a picture of them there, but you think about what those British Museum collections looked like in 1873 or 1872, and that's what they're experiencing, and that's where their journey kind of to the Holy Land begins in that sense, right? Is actually right here at the British Museum. Now, the other thing that I found fascinating of reading their time in London before they even get to Palestine is they made a few calls while they were here in London. And some of those calls actually I thought were pretty interesting. One was they decided to call upon Jabez Burns, whose handbook they were actually using. In fact, it just dawned on me this week that it might be possible that they acquired the handbook here in London as they went to meet with Jabez Burns. They talked with him. It's possible that he gave them the book. I don't know for sure, but they did make that connection. They met him in person. The other person that they called upon, and this was an interesting thing that Felicity and I have been emailing back and forth the last few days, is they also called upon this really fascinating character, William Hepworth Dixon, who was a founding member of the Palestine Exploration Fund and was the executive. He was chairman for several years, and we think probably even during the very year they're here. Yeah. So apparently, that could have been just a natural call to make. Well, let's stop into the PEF and talk with them. But it turns out there's another connection here, and that is that Hepworth Dixon, this founding member of the PEF who was the chairman during this time period, himself had actually been to Utah. He had actually made a trip to America previously, had met Mormons, probably these Mormons, in Salt Lake City. And so for them to call on him, they might have already had a connection there. I just thought that was a fascinating part of the early phase of this journey, to stay across from the British Museum, see the collection, contact one or two local people who could inform them about their upcoming trip. And one of those people has a direct connection with the PEF. So I just thought that was a fun thing that I had not noticed until just this week. If any of you know more about Hepworth Dixon, by the way, I'm sure there's a fascinating story there. So I look forward to learning more about him myself. Okay, so once they leave London, though, now they're ready for the trip to continue eastward. And as you can imagine, to get from London to Palestine, they need to go all throughout Europe first. And this part of the trip is very much like the old Grand Tour, right? They're going to Amsterdam, they go through Paris, they go down through Rome. They actually stop in at Pompeii. One of my favorite parts of the journals and the letters is when they stop in Pompeii and they're marveling at the ancient Roman remains that they're seeing. But George A. Smith, who is well over 300 pounds, wants to climb Mount Vesuvius. And so what he does is he actually hires 4 locals to carry him in a chair up Mount Vesuvius. So sadly, I do not have a picture of that. But if any of you have that picture in your attic or something, that would be the choice. So they're going on this trip. But they also make their way down to Alexandria, right, where they stay in Alexandria for a few days. While they are there, they stay at a hotel designed to host and accommodate, sitting in this kind of staged photo studio surrounded by what are surely fake palm trees and everything. But he's wearing his fez, right? His Turkish hat here. Right? So anyway, this is a really character. Eliza R. Snow also sits for one of these portraits. This is a really great image of her as well. And you can see on the other side of the picture card, you can see how they're writing little notes and sending them back to their friends back in Utah. It is fascinating to note, while we're just on their Alexandria stop, that while they were in Alexandria, of course they saw some Egyptian antiquities, including, it turns out that they saw Cleopatra's Needle. Before it had been removed from Alexandria, shipped over to London, and set up here by the embankment stop on the Thames. They actually saw it in Alexandria before it had been shipped here. So it really is kind of fun to see these snapshots, these little vignettes of their tour along the way, and to see some of those really interesting local connections, including an Egyptian obelisk that would eventually make its way to London. Okay, now for the time in Palestine itself. This is really the moment we've been waiting for, of course. So what happens when they get to Palestine? Well, in this case, we not only have their extraordinarily detailed letters and the correspondence of this group, but at this point, to help us understand the itinerary and the experience in Palestine, we do have the earliest Thomas Cook guidebook It's not yet in print. It would not be in print for another 3 years, 1876. But by reading the 1876 edition, looking at its itinerary map, and comparing those notes with the group's letters, it's really consistent that this is clearly the mapped out itinerary. So being able to read the book, put that into conversation with the letters, we get a really good sense of how the trip worked. Because we obviously don't have time tonight to go into the whole trip, I'll just give you a very brief overview of the itinerary, and then we'll circle back and talk about their time in Jerusalem in particular, which is where I think it gets really, really interesting. So very quickly, the itinerary goes as follows. They sail from Egypt to Jaffa, where they disembark. They have their whole experience at the customs house, and it's in Jaffa that they not only get their first view of the Holy Land that they had come to visit, but they meet the Thomas Cook agents that are there in Jaffa, and right outside the city, the Thomas Cook agents already have the entire tent encampment ready for them to go. It's a remarkable setup, actually. Reading their journals about these Thomas Cook accommodations, it's a reminder of how detailed the logistics really were. I mean, you can't just bring a group of, in this case, mostly elderly, sometimes quite physically out of shape people, right, from the Western United States, and bring them all the way. I mean, there's logistics involved here, and that includes tents and cooks and guides. And reading their letters, they are also struck by this. This is from George A. Smith. He talks about how Miss Eliza R. Snow and Miss Clara Little, they had their tent. Paul Shetler, myself, we occupied another, over which floated the Stars and Stripes. So apparently they would, fly the American flag over their tent as they're going through Palestine. Lorenzo Snow, Albert Carrington, some of the others occupied another tent. And then George describes his tent. Well, my tent was used as our dining room. We were then supplied with good camp stools. We had iron-framed bedsteads with good mattresses that would travel along with us, right? And good, clean, nice blankets and sheets that were all prepared by the Thomas Cook Company. Then he digresses. All the difficulty about it was with me was that my bedstead was too small for me. So he's a large man trying to fit into one of these small iron bedsteads. And the other thing, of course, he notices is that our way we're going to travel is mostly going to be on horseback, which he says is great. But I at first tried walking most of the time. I wanted to give my horse a break until I realized, but because of the rough roads in some places I would dismount and lead my animal. I found, however, that the horse could stand better than I could, so I rode him. And I believe that some of the prayers of the saints back in Utah must have kept that horse up, or he would have stumbled. I rode that horse 400 miles, 300 of which there was no road with any right to the name, and he never slipped or stumbled once. So he was quite impressed with this horse, really, brought him all over the land. Yeah. Anyway, this is not that group, but it's just that's a photo from that general time period of what these encampments looked like, just reminding us of the logistics of getting a group like this across Palestine. Well, from Jaffa, of course, they go straight to Jerusalem, and along the way, they start having their first real reflections on what it's like to be in the land of the Bible. For time's sake, I'll just mention some of these reflections. As you can imagine, they're very pious. I mean, they're very this is the land of the Holy Land. This is the land of the biblical prophets and the land of Jesus. And they're having these very religious experiences when they're there, right? As you probably know from other travel narratives, some of those religious experiences will become much more complicated when they actually get to Jerusalem and they see an Ottoman period city that looks nothing like what they expected to see. But initially, the journey is just breathtaking for them in its spiritual implications. Lorenzo, Eliza says the same thing, and they're talking about the reflections on the biblical past, but also their reflections on the future glories of biblical prophecy in the land as they understand them. So it's really an interesting reflection. And then, as I said, they get to Jerusalem itself. There's a famous photo of the Jaffa Gate with the Thomas Cook travel sign at an office right next to the Jaffa Gate. Apparently, at least this early group, their encampment when they first got to Jerusalem was actually the tent encampment just located outside of Jaffa Gate going down towards the Hinnom Valley. And so that's where they stayed. They were still in their tents. They were just right outside of Jaffa Gate. I'll come back to their experience in the city here in a moment, but it was the old city of 1873 that they are experiencing in all of its complexities and intriguing features. Right? Let me just quickly mention what the rest of the itinerary looks like, and then we'll circle back and we'll talk more about their time in Jerusalem. After spending a few days in Jerusalem, their guides take them on a journey through the Judean desert. This is a fascinating one because they obviously go down to Bethlehem, where they see the so-called Solomon's pools, right down there, the large water systems that are just outside of Bethlehem that obviously had nothing to do with Solomon, but at the time, that's how they were identified. And they are going to Bethlehem, where they are having lunch in the shepherd's fields and thinking about the gospel stories of Jesus' birth, going to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. They end up going down to Marsaba Monastery, which is an interesting experience. Of course, the women cannot go into the monastery, so Eliza Snow and Clara Little have to wait outside while the men all go in and experience the monastery with the monks, the Greek Orthodox community. And then they work their way through the Judean desert, eventually up through the Dead Sea. They end up passing what we now would know as the site of Qumran. They end up going past Jericho. And that branch of the trip really is fascinating in and of itself. If you are interested in those logistics, I encourage you to check out the material. But yeah, there's Bethlehem, Marsaba Monastery, and they start working their way through the desert, basically along the Kidron Valley, basically, going all the way down to where it empties out into the Dead Sea. It is fascinating to note that it's in this part of the journey that things get a little perilous for them. Without going into the details because of time, I'll just say that it's on this part, as they're going from Marsaba Monastery down to the Dead Sea, that they're attacked by a group of Bedouin. And their guides have to fight off the attacking party. They're firing muskets in the air, and there's a bit of an altercation. And then their guides kind of calm things down and work things out, and the attacking Bedouin group kind of flees off into the desert. And at the end, the group was wondering, was that for real? Was that staged? What was that, actually? And there's a little debate among the group as to whether that was an authentic attack or if that was just part of the experience, right? To kind of stage a bit of an altercation with local Bedouin. Really an interesting experience. They end up going to the Dead Sea. Eliza Snow is writing poetry. I'm going quickly because I'm just looking at our time, and I want to get to the good stuff. Okay, and then finally after the Dead Sea, they end up making their way back to Jerusalem, and they do so via Jericho. It is interesting, I'll stop here to quickly note that while they go to Jericho, they do reflect on the biblical material in Jericho, the biblical events recorded about Jericho. But while they're there, they also noted that Jericho had been recently, they don't use the word excavated, I guess, but recently been explored. Jericho, or rather the old site of that city, has a good many mounds. Men have recently dug into many of them, but we are told that no valuables had been found. Historically, I think the guys they must be talking about is the Charles Warren expedition, because it had only been a few years ago that he had actually dug his trenches into Jericho. So it's quite possible, actually I think it's likely, that what they're seeing is they're seeing Charles Warren's trenches that he dug on the mound right there at Jericho. So they don't mention Warren by name here, but it's clear that they're encountering some of his expedition work. That's kind of fun. And then finally, there's really lots of great stuff here, but I'm going to go ahead and skip. They go back to Jerusalem, and then they have the whole itinerary. They go to Bethel, Shiloh, Shechem, Mount Gerizim. They go up to the Galilee area. They go up to Mount Hermon. They're trapped in this really intense snowstorm up there on Mount Hermon. All the tents blow away. I mean, they have the whole experience, right? Until they finally go up to Damascus, Beirut, and then sail back home via Constantinople and back to Europe, and then back to the United States. So I know that was very quick overview, but that's their itinerary. Probably pretty common for the early Thomas Cook tours to Palestine, but seeing their accounts with that type of detail really is great. So here's where I want to end. We've got about 10 minutes left. What I want to end is actually sharing some of the experiences that they have in Jerusalem itself, because this is where I think it gets really interesting. The first category is simply their views of the old city. And I think I'm going to go quickly over this one as well, because this is really common stuff. If you've read the Protestant travel narratives of pilgrims going to the old city and kind of their conflicted experience, right? Kind of their letdown in their expectations. They were expecting to see the great places that Jesus, was buried and so forth. And what they end up seeing is a city that's very crammed and not very well, not the hygiene level isn't very high, and the poverty is clear, and then you get to the holy sites that are contested by various Eastern Orthodox. It's just not the religious experience that Western Protestants were expecting to have. These Latter-day Saints have the exact same kind of conflicted experience as they're going to the Holy Sepulchre, seeing the traditional sites, and wanting to have a really great religious experience, but then just being struck by the souvenir markets and the poverty, and then the tensions, like the broom fights between, the Greek Orthodox and the Eastern, whatever. It's just not what they expected to see. But at the same time, they're like, yeah, but this is the place of the Bible. So they're trying to reconcile their religious expectations and some feelings of piety with kind of the messy complexities that are actually, Jerusalem in the 1870s. So that's really interesting. A lot of that comes out in their visit to the Holy Sepulchre. This is where George A. Smith definitely channels his inner Mark Twain. He actually quotes Twain. He says, yeah, I know what Twain is talking about here when he was kind of smirking to himself about the grave of Adam, right? And George A. Smith has a similar experience, whereas I'm looking down on the grave of Adam, and we were quite dubious of these attributions. But at the same time, the other members of this party said, yeah, but this is the place where Jesus was buried by a tradition, and they were trying to have that type of experience as well. They're there at the time when the whole Miristan area is being leveled in preparation for the excavations and eventually the building of the Church of the Redeemer. So they're there at a very interesting moment. And of course, while they're there, they do go up to the Mount of Olives, and they actually follow in Orson Hyde's footsteps. Go up to the Mount of Olives. They also, they don't just build an altar, they actually put up a tent on the Mount of Olives, just north of the Russian Church of the Ascension. And while they're there, they actually dedicate this tent as kind of a Mormon tabernacle. And they offer prayers in that dedicated space for the future flourishing of Jerusalem and the fulfillment of biblical prophecies, very much like their predecessor Orson Hyde had done on the Mount of Olives, probably about that same vantage point. So that's their kind of religious experience that were there. It was mixed. It was complex, as most experiences were for Western Protestants visiting the city. Now, to conclude, though, there are two other things that I wanted to mention that are directly related to the work of the PEF, and these are some of the reasons why I find this trip so fascinating. They are here in 1873, meaning the work of Charles Warren had only been completed about 3 years earlier. Right? I believe he finishes his work in 1870 in Jerusalem and then moves on. So those tunnels are fresh. I mean, those excavation experiences, those expedition reminiscences are currently the talk of the town. And our group that we're looking at here, they experience that. So when they get to Jerusalem, they are very aware of the fact that Warren had just dug the tunnels outside the Temple Mount. They're very aware that Warren had surveyed the kind of the subterranean water systems of the Temple Mount. And they comment on these things and even mention Charles Warren by name. In fact, here's from George A. Smith's later reminiscence. He said, learned men have dug deeply under Jerusalem in search of evidence to determine its original site, but an alarm was created that the monkery of the place might be spoiled by determining that certain localities were not where they are now represented. So he's kind of taking jabs at local traditions of where certain biblical sites might be located, but he saw the work of these learned men as kind of challenging some of those traditional assumptions. And the government was moved to stop the investigation, to close up the investigations, and we were not actually allowed to enter these excavated tunnels. Later he will mention Charles Warren by name. He will say some English archaeologists, led by Captain Charles Warren, sunk a shaft 140 feet near St. Stephen's Gate, right just out to the northeast corner of the Temple Mount, and found the city wall of Solomon, which was a common interpretation of what he'd found, I think, at the time. The Turkish government stopped those explorations, and they are now closed up. So they were not able to go down into the tunnels like some previous visitors had been able to. By this point, Warren's tunnels were closed up, but they were aware of them, and there was clearly a part of the conversation of these tourists here, literally in the years, just 2 or 3 years after Warren's expedition. Same thing with his work under the Temple Mount as well. They are stunned as they go to the Temple Mount to learn, to hear stories about how recent explorers, Charles Warren, had been under the platform of the Temple Mount, had actually seen the water systems, and they're commenting on what Warren found down there in terms of the large reservoirs and water channels that he would document in his underground Jerusalem work. Now, the last one that I want to mention, just because this is too good to pass up, I was just endlessly fascinated by a very offhanded remark made in one of the journals, one of the letters that were sent home. And this is a letter by George A. Smith, who says that as they were walking down Christian Quarter Road in the Christian Quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, there they visited the antiquities shop of Moses Shapira. Right, so Moses Shapira, as we all know, an infamous antiquities dealer and manuscript collector who in 1883 had what we now call the Shapira affair, right? The claim that he had found 15 fragments of Deuteronomy in a cave near the Dead Sea, and that these were the oldest biblical manuscripts to be discovered, trying to sell them to the British Museum. I'm sure at the PDF you all know this story quite well. Fascinating moment that, at the time was declared to be a forgery after it was celebrated. And today, of course, there are still some who debate back and forth over the legitimacy of what Shapira found. What was fascinating about this account, though, is the so-called Shapira affair that brings all of our current attention to Moses Shapira was in 1883. That is 10 years after his antiquities shop was visited by this group of Latter-day Saint leaders. What they saw in the antiquities shop actually is pretty interesting. And I don't know how many Shapira scholars have actually spent time with this material. I've been in touch with a few, and my sense is that there's a lot here to mine. So let's take a quick look. This is what George A. Smith says in one of his letters. He says, "We visited Mr. Shapira's collection of ancient parchments." This is 10 years before the Deuteronomy affair of 1883. So we saw his collection of ancient parchments. Some of them were very old, dug from beneath the ruins of synagogues in both Palestine and Arabia. They possess much interest. Now, what he's about ready to describe must be the way that Shapira or Shapira's employees described the significance of these manuscripts. Here's what George A. Smith goes on to say. He says, "These writings are on various kinds and qualities of parchment, one of which, found in the mountains of Moab," sounds a lot like the later Deuteronomy affair, right? "Discloses the idea that the gods, plural, were male and female, and that religion," meaning kind of this purest form of religion, actually predated Moses. This is a really interesting statement because, number one, it suggests that 10 years before we thought there were these biblical manuscripts in the collection that claimed to have variants from the Hebrew Bible that brought so much notoriety to Shapira in 1883. 10 years before that, he must have already been showing them something like this, and something like this that he already was claiming was found in the mountains of Moab. And so when I found this reference, and then he goes on to describe some of these really interesting variants, the reasons why George A. Smith highlighted these, the gods were both male and female, and that there was this pure form of religion that predated Moses. These are all things that would deeply have resonated with the Latter-day Saint community. So he saw these claims as being something that Latter-day Saints would be uniquely interested in. So that's why he's highlighting them, sending them back. But as I found this reference, I actually contacted 3 or 4 scholars who are currently working on Shapira, and I just basically asked them, what do you think they're looking at? I mean, I'm aware of the story 10 years later, but as far as I know, the 15 manuscripts were supposedly announced in 1883. What are they looking at 10 years earlier? And so far, not a lot of our colleagues have been able to identify what this is. So if any of you happen to resonate with the story, or you have some insights in this story, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because something clearly is happening a lot earlier in the Moses Shapira antiquity shop than we once supposed. And it's this travel narrative that gives us that little glimpse into something interesting going on there. So I think there's a lot more to unpack here at some point. And if anyone's interested in sharing your thoughts on it, I am all ears. All right, and so that's that. And then finally, the narratives end, as you can imagine, with their parting reflections and all of their complexity, right? What a fascinating experience for these people from the American West to travel all the way across the world, encounter these biblical sites and all their complexity. Eliza Snow kind of recalls her lingering, looking over Jerusalem for the last time, ends up writing some quite beautiful poetry about Jerusalem as she had at all the other sites, kind of reflecting again on its biblical past, its current complexity, and its future glories, according to biblical prophecy as they understood it. And that's where the story ends, at least for tonight. So I just wanted to highlight the story because, again, it's not that I've got a great thesis tonight or a great argument that I'm trying to make, other than the fact that this is one more great account of a group experiencing 19th century Palestine, experiencing travel, seeing these things through the eyes of this really unique group of American religious communities in the American West. I just thought was something that would be really helpful to be part of the larger conversation as we are talking together about what it means to travel to this region, experience it, explore it, have adventures in it, and I hope this is a helpful insight into one of those experiences. So thank you very much.
you, Matt. That was fascinating. I mean, I've got all sorts of questions. I wondered, do you have any insights into how the members of the group interacted with each other? Were there kind of people who got on, people who didn't?
Yeah, we always want to know that, don't we? Yeah, in this case they did seem to get on pretty well. I don't see any description of them fighting. They do have different perspectives. As I said, when they go to certain sites, Smith was always really snarky. Eliza Snow starts writing her poetry, and her brother Lorenzo Snow just starts, kind of waxing eloquent. So they do have different personalities that they're experiencing, but I don't see a lot of tension between them. I mean, they seem to be getting along quite well.
That's quite an achievement, because it would have been a rough ride.
It is, exactly. Now, having said that, most of the surviving accounts come from letters that they wanted published in the Salt Lake newspaper. So it's quite possible that along the way there were some more interesting bits, but that didn't get published. But yeah, great question.
Does anyone else have any questions for that?
Yeah.
Was any motivation articulated for why they would send a contingency to the Holy Land? Was any reason given?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So really there are two kind of underlining reasons. One is that at the Latter-day Saint tradition from the very beginning, there was this interest in biblical learning. So Joseph Smith had brought in a Hebrew scholar to teach the community Hebrew early on. They were just avid collectors of books, and they were reading biblical commentaries. So there's just kind of this inherent Latter-day Saint excitement about learning biblical things that's there. But I think more than that, probably what's happening here is this desire to send church leaders to the region, probably as a way to kind of invoke the power of heaven to, let's get the biblical prophecies on the rail. Let's get this show on the rail. Let's bring about these biblical prophecies, and that somehow their experience, their prayers, their kind of calling on the favors of heaven would help bring about those end times prophetic fulfillments, I guess. And it just sounded fascinating. So as they're just like, this is just going to be a great experience. So I think that there's probably a lot of motivations that are behind their experience. Some are more articulated than others. But yeah, it's a great question.
Any others for that?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for that. Very, very fascinating. I was just wondering, I mean, Edward Robinson, who was an American, wrote his book about travels in Palestine.
Yes, that's right.
20 years ago. Didn't they refer to that, or was it just ignored?
I'd see no reference to Edward Robinson's works. I mean, you're absolutely right. That book would have been in circulation. I know that Latter-day Saints are familiar with Edward Robinson because in the days of Joseph Smith, 1830s, 1840s, they refer to him. In fact, there's a kind of indirect connection between Edward Robinson and the Hebrew instructor that Joseph Smith brought to the community to teach them Hebrew. They were both colleagues at a certain time. So I think the Latter-day Saints were very aware of Edward Robinson, but that is not one of the resources that they draw upon. They don't reference him as a particular lens through which they experienced their trip to Palestine in 1873. So they're aware of him, but he does not feature prominently in this narrative.
Would that be on a religious basis, or was it just, it seems very odd?
I don't think so. I other than the fact that by that point, Robinson's book is 30 years old. I don't know if it was just already so well integrated into the guidebooks already. I mean, they were basically using the guidebooks, the Jabez Burns, kind of the predecessor to the Thomas Cook guidebook. And frankly, I don't remember those guidebooks referring to Robinson either. So I don't know that Robinson is as critical as he was, as essential as he was. I don't know that he was someone that everyone felt that they needed to consult as they were reading. Plus, those are two large volumes, 2 or 3 large volumes of Edward Robinson. So maybe just schlepping them around maybe itself is not logistically feasible.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh yes, one more.
Did this trip, was this like the first of many, or for the Mormons in Utah, and in present day, is there something established there now?
There is, yes and yes. So this is the second trip. The first one was that very brief 1841 trip by Orson Hyde, but really was this trip that opened up Latter-day Saint tourism to the Holy Land in a major way. So after this 1873 trip, you had follow-up trips by church leaders, and then eventually later, larger church member groups who would go over in the 1880s, 1890s. By the 20th century, at least after the First and Second World Wars, Latter-day Saint tourism to the Holy Land just flourished. And so since 1988, Brigham Young University has had a campus in Jerusalem. It's the Brigham Young University Jerusalem Center for Near Eastern Studies. So it's kind of a study abroad campus for art. So Latter-day Saints have now been going to the Holy Land for many, many years, and it continues to just be an increasingly interesting thing for members of the community. But you're right, this trip really opened the doors for that kind of widespread Latter-day Saint tourism to the Holy Land. Yeah.
You got referenced in one of the Thomas Cook slides to the Cataract Association,
Ah,
I noticed.
okay,
And
yeah.
I wondered what the connection there was with.
That is a great question. I don't know. That's a great. Was it on the poster?
It was on one of the posters, yes, the
okay.
Southern Cataract Association.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not a Thomas Cook scholar. I would be fascinated to know what that's referencing. Does anyone know? I don't.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, thanks. That's something to look into.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Good observation.
There was one over there.
Oh yeah.
Oh, don't, not sorry. Just thinking about the itinerary as well, they're also coming into contact with established Christianity
Yes.
in the region. Do they write about them much?
They do.
Okay.
Yeah, they do. In fact, that's one of the really interesting parts of their itinerary is how they experience, as Western American Latter-day Saints, how they experience not only going to the Holy Sepulchre and seeing the different groups, but then they'll encounter other pilgrimage groups from Russia, Armenia, and it's a contact of two completely different worlds, and they're just fascinated by it. So Eliza Snow in particular is just so reflective on what it was like to meet Armenian women. And they couldn't communicate, but they could hold, she could hold the babies, and like they noticed that there was a funeral happening, and so they attended the funeral. They didn't know what was happening, but they saw the mourning rituals of this Armenian community, and they would experience this throughout the entire thing. They went to Nazareth and then ended up going to the local, I believe it was a local Anglican church, and ended up hearing a local sermon in English, but then they heard a follow-up sermon in what they called Aramaic, but must have been Syriac or maybe Arabic. I don't know what they're hearing actually. But yeah, so they are commenting on this, and Jewish communities as well. There's a really interesting moment when they're in Tiberias, and Eliza Snow breaks off from the group and actually goes to spend time with a Jewish family and the women of that Jewish family. Again, communication barriers, but really interesting observations. So if those types of relationships are interesting to you, these letters would be very helpful. Yeah,
Fascinating stuff.
it's great.
Okay, well, I think on that note, if you would join me in thanking Matt for his really interesting lecture.
Thank you.